Into the Dark. Obviously, spoilers ahead, I've got some thoughts about this one. So let's talk about it. The last two episodes, I was very, very positive on this show, and I'm a little bit mixed on this one. I think it is both exciting and makes some potential missteps. So, to get started, combining like a flashback episode with the Spirit World episode makes complete sense to me. That makes perfect sense, because that is what the Spirit World, for a large part, is. It is like a reflection of your own thoughts and emotions and state of being. So all of them ending up in the Spirit World together and going on their own like spiritual self-reflection journeys makes a lot of sense. They really are very good at picking what episodes to combine to make a new 40-minute episode. That said, I was expecting this episode more so to end up somehow with Zuko following Aang into the Spirit World and Aang taking Sokka and Katara into the Spirit World. I expected this to be a stand-in for the Storm episode, which I just feel like at this point isn't going to happen, which again harkens back to the idea that this show is meant for people who've seen the original. So doing an entire exposition episode with flashbacks about these two guys' backstories isn't entirely necessary because we already know that. They just assume that we already know that, so they tackle these kind of things from a different angle. Instead, this episode is more similar to The Swamp from Season 2. The Zuko portion of the episode is very small. It's him just coming to terms with the fact that people are finding out about the Avatar, so he needs to be quick about capturing Aang. June gets introduced, doesn't really do anything. It's more of a setup for next episode, I'm assuming. And there's really not much to it there, I'm going to be honest with you. So we're going to talk about the Aang side of the episode mostly, because that is 90% of the episode. And first, and to start off with that, I do want to say this is another example of the show here making a very good reference to the original material without it feeling very forced and annoying. I mean, it's very in your face, but Sokka tries to like calm down a little girl, and he's like, "Oh, you've got a doll. What's her name?" She doesn't have a name. Well, let's give her a name, and then he comes up with the cover name that Aang comes up with on the fly as a cover name to get into Omashu in the original series, which I'm not going to even try to pronounce because that's the whole point of that name, is that it is an insane name to just think of on the spot, and then in the original show, Katara just picks it up, no problem whatsoever. That's a fun little thing, right? They just take that name, anybody who knows the original show is going to go, "Oh, I know that reference," and we can just move on. You don't have to make like a 2-minute scene out of it. Before we dive into the Spirit World itself, let's take a little bit of time though to talk about Zuko and his little bit of story that is going on here, because it's mostly set up for future stuff, but I do want to mention it. Zuko's been pretty consistently antagonizing his lieutenants, and you can see that the guy's kind of done with it. And honestly, I like this as characterization for Zuko because it makes him a more believable, angry teenager who's trying to hide his own insecurities about not really knowing what the hell he's doing in the first place. And it makes me feel like we didn't get the Agni Kai between Zhao and Zuko yet, and we might still get that in the future, but I feel like what is being set up might be an Agni Kai between Zuko and this lieutenant, which, if that is the case, would be a little bit weird for the viewer, because at that point, who are we supposed to be rooting for? Because Zuko has been the absolute dickhead in this situation. The lieutenant's been nothing but pleasant, really. And so that means that we're supposed to root against Zuko, which makes sense because he's also the antagonist from Aang's perspective, which is our hero. But this show is very much aimed towards people who already know the full story and know that Zuko is a secondary protagonist. Meaning that we're going to be rooting against Zuko if that ends up happening, which is kind of weird. So I hope that I'm just jumping to wrong conclusions about that, and that's not where we're going with this. Because that's one of these things that in the original show, they do it very well, is you have that Agni Kai against Zhao to very early on have a opportunity for the viewer to be rooting for Zuko. And if that same Agni Kai, well, it's a different Agni Kai, but if that scene is now morphed into something where we're suddenly rooting against Zuko, the whole point of that scene kind of falls apart. So I'm hoping that they don't go in that direction. It's just something that my mind made up, and isn't actually happening. And while we're on the Zuko side, we might as well talk about the Fire Nation at large, that being also Ozai and Azula, because Azula is doing her manipulation, like, oh, maybe that Commander Zhao seems real cool. Maybe you should give him some more resources, Daddy. And I was just like, yeah, that seems like a good idea, but I can see through you. I see what you're doing. Don't do this. Don't be like this. Zuko found the Avatar. Zuko is a real example of what I'm looking for in an heir. And I'm just sitting here like, what the fuck? Who is this Ozai? This is not Ozai. Granted, Ozai was very happy with Zuko when he thought that he had killed Aang in the end of Book 2, beginning of Book 3. And he honestly believed that, and he was happy to welcome Zuko home and restore his right to the throne. So we could be seeing a little bit of that going through here, but this honestly feels like not what Ozai was like. Specifically, also knowing a lot more of the comic backstory on Zuko and Ozai, the fact that throughout all his life, Ozai has pretty much been looking for a reason to get rid of Zuko, because he doesn't see him as fit for the family, for the royal family. With that in mind, this doesn't feel right. The only thing that I can think of that would set this right, if they really, in the next episode or so, expound on this, is the fact that he's using, complimenting Zuko as a way to drive Azula even more, to strive to be better. And that might be eventually what ends up unlocking her blue flames, because she doesn't really have that yet. We see a fireband for the first time here, and it is orange and then flickers blue very, very shortly. Later in the episode, at the very end, we see her training, and it's just purely orange fire. There's little flickers of blue, little explosions of blue, but for the most part, she's just normal firebending. So I'm thinking they might make the unlock of properly blue firebending a thing that we get a character arc for a little bit more, which would be interesting. The blue flame, of course, is a sign of more powerful, more hot fire. It's also always been a visual image for her mental state. So I'm hoping it's not just she drives herself to be better and as such results in more powerful firebending. I hope that mental state of the pressure and the stress that she's under, warping her mind to some extent, plays into that color of that fire. Because that's honestly, to me, the more important part of her differently colored fire. Of course, the real reason that the fire for Azula is blue is because the moment her character was created, they knew that they were going to have that final battle against Zuko, and it's just visually spectacular to have the orange and blue flames clashing against each other. That is the real reason that they did that, and then they probably came up with reasons for it, but they did that very well, and I'm a little worried how they're going to deal with that in this show. Also, the pirates and the Great Divide are offhandedly mentioned when Zuko is asking around about Aang and Katara, which implies that those episodes did happen off-screen, which for the Great Divide, that's fine. For the pirate episode, that doesn't fully make sense, because the whole thing about the pirate episode is that they're trying to find waterbending scrolls to learn, and they steal one and they get into trouble with the pirates, and then all the episode happens. They already have a waterbending scroll here, so they don't have to steal one. So it doesn't make sense that that episode would still happen. I know that it's just a offhanded reference to the original series, just hey, we know the original series exists. Fans, be happy that we reference it. And to a certain extent, yeah, but also, if you're going to reference that, it's only going to get picked up by people who've seen the original show. And then the only people who pick up that reference are going to realize that that doesn't make any sense. So maybe, the Great Divide, fine. There's no continuity issues with that at all. So just drop that one. The pirates isn't necessarily needed. Then again, maybe the pirate episode happened differently off screen in this version of events, but we didn't see that, so we can't assume that that happened. Now, all that said, let's go into the spirit world, because that is what we're here for in the first place, right? And this is really, this episode made me think that I think that the order of events and the actual trajectory of this show might actually indeed be going in a very different direction from a very similar starting point. Like the first couple episodes were very similar. The further we get in, the more differences we're starting to see. Things are getting lifted from episodes way down the line and being put into this, which might be a sign that they're thinking that they're only going to be making this one season rather, and just stuffing it full with all the best bits from the entire series, because they know they're going to cancel this after like one season, which is not entirely unrealistic to assume that that might be happening, because we see one sheet tongue here, and might that imply that we're not getting a library episode? Because I don't think we can skip the library episode, because that's a huge plot point in the overall series, them finding out about the Day of Black Sun. And you can't skip the invasion either, because that's a huge part of the whole story as well, from Zuko's perspective and from Aang's perspective. So I don't know. Including Wan Shi Tong here doesn't necessarily exclude the fact that the library episode will happen later down the line anyway. The same thing with the fact that this is pretty much a stand-in for the Swamp episode. Doesn't mean that the Swamp episode itself won't be able to happen later as well. The Swamp is a little bit less necessarily irreplaceable, I would say. The only thing that really is important in there is that Aang sees a vision of Toph before they actually meet her, which means that when they meet her, he has more of an inkling of, hey, that's who I'm supposed to be working with to learn airbending. They can just make that like a Avatar feeling and get rid of the Swamp episode altogether if they wanted to. But it doesn't necessarily mean that if they do something in this season, that the next season they won't reuse those same characters and their same concepts for the actual episodes that these bits are lifted from. One of the visions, for instance, is the whole backstory on how Katara's mom got killed, more or less. Anyway, we see Katara hiding. Katara is actually present for her mother being burned alive here, which makes it 10 times more horrifying for her. But usually this entire backstory is divulged over the course of an episode where she goes on like this murder mission to get revenge on her mother's killer. Which is a very important step in her forgiving Zuko and learning to trust him and all that kind of stuff. We can't have that episode the same way anymore because we've already seen a huge portion of that backstory now in this episode. Meaning that either that episode in the future doesn't happen, or it has to happen in a different way. Because the whole structure of that episode is banking on those flashbacks being told to us from different perspectives bit by bit, and now we've seen a quite significant amount of it already, so that no longer works. And that is what I'm saying. We're using different bits of the series as a whole here to stuff things into the first season, and while right now in the first season I'm quite enjoying seeing all these different things, it does make me think, but what will be left for the future of the show if we go through a season 2 and a season 3? And the only thing that I can think of is there will have to just be new content. Things will have to go in a slightly different direction. Events will have to happen slightly differently because a lot of the things that happen later on usually are already happening. And some things are happening earlier and worse as well, such as Ko. Ko is in this episode because we're in the spirit world, so we don't just get introduced to him as a nebulous, somewhat dangerous help in the finale episode. He's just here, and they... Remember when in the second episode review, I went on a little bit of a rant about Kiyoshi's personality being butchered? They did the same to Ko. They did my boy dirty. Because usually Ko is this strange, otherworldly being which plays by his own like set of rules. None of that is here. He's just an evil spirit who collects people to eat their face. That's just all there is to him. There's no nuance there. There's no strange, otherworldly presence about him. He's still a creepy centipede dude with like changing faces, don't get me wrong. But the whole idea of him being beyond human understanding and honestly being fair with Aang, right? Aang played by his rules, not showing any emotion. He came to ask a question, Ko answered it, Aang left. He faced the danger, played by the rules, and everything happened properly. That's just not what Ko is like in this version of events, and that's some real Legend of Korra shit. Ruining Spirit World. I'm gonna be real with you. I love the Legend of Korra. I really, really do. I think among Avatar fans, I'm among the kind of people that like Legend of Korra more than average, I would say. I even think parts of Season 2 are more palatable than people give it credit for. It's still the worst season out of the show, by a long shot. But I think parts of it are more palatable until we get to like Dark Avatar kaiju fights. That is fucking stupid. Another thing that I don't like about Season 2 of Legend of Korra is the fact that they absolutely butcher the Spirit World. Like, they ruin it. They're absolutely horrible. Except for one thing, and that is the Fog of Lost Souls. The Fog of Lost Souls in The Legend of Korra Season 2 is honestly the only thing about that season and the spirits in that season that feels like it would fit within the spirit world of The Last Airbender. And they do take that from The Legend of Korra and introduce it here, which I really, really do like. So they might have murdered Ko as like a concept. They absolutely ruined that, but they also did introduce something else that I do like. So it's a little 50-50. I hope in the next episode, maybe, when we get a little bit more time with Ko, they might be able to rectify what they did there, but I don't have high hopes for that, to be honest with you. And then we get to one more Lost Spirit World thing. Gyatso is just hanging out in the Spirit World. The Spirit World, I feel the need to point out, and I shouldn't need to point this out, but apparently I did. The Spirit World isn't heaven, okay? Iroh ending up there in The Legend of Korra was a little sus as it is, but it's very clearly stated that he chose to leave his physical body behind. So what likely happened is he just meditated into the spirit world and let his physical body die. And that is why he as a spirit exists in the spirit world. I'm not the biggest fan of that explanation as it is, but it's been established that Iroh has a very strong spiritual drive, and I can kind of live with that explanation. The explanation here is just that the other airbenders chose to move on and I stuck behind in the spirit world. And sorry, no, that's just not how that works. I know that I maybe shouldn't always be comparing things, and I'm trying not to, but it's really hard sometimes not to compare things to the original show, right? This is an entirely separate piece of media, which might work on slightly different canon. But I think it's also valid to critique things that don't fully make a lot of sense within the context of, okay, so what is the spirit world? What is it supposed to be? What is it supposed to represent? And the spirit world is supposed to represent the metaphysical being of nature. Like, you have the forest spirit there, Heibai, which also comes by real quickly. He's not that focused on at the moment. You have Heibai, which is like the metaphysical spirit representation of that specific forest. And then you have someone like Ko, who is a representation of identity or lack or loss of identity, right? And in the comics, then you get the Mother of Faces, which is the embodiment of individuality, which is a very primal and old spirit. So these spirits are supposed to be representations of physical things in the world, given some kind of spiritual, metaphysical form. It's not just a lot of dead people hanging out there. That's not what the spirit world is. That's not what the ascension of what a spirit is supposed to be is anyway. And I think it's not so much that they might be a little different in this show. I think it is that you're fundamentally misunderstanding what the original show was trying to do or was trying to say, and in such making mistakes in adapting it. And that's very similar to what I complained about in the Omashu episode, right? It's much more surface level there, but the Omashu delivery system, the whole point of it is that it is mostly aided by gravity. Earthbending gets the cards up, gravity gets them down. The first thing we see, and then eventually a plot point of the episode, is based on those cards also sliding uphill, and that's just not how that works. Somebody on the crew there fundamentally did not understand the point of the Omashu delivery system. And in the same way here, I feel like some people here working on this show just fundamentally misunderstood what the spirits and the spirit world were. And that is where my issue comes in. I don't mind differences. I'm actually quite excited for things to be going differently. But that is from a plot point to plot point perspective. Have events happen differently? I am all for that. But the underlying reasoning and meaning of what things in the world are and how things work in the world, I think you should be a lot more careful with. And if you change something, you should have good reasons for changing it, and things shouldn't be changed because you missed the entire point of the original version of it. And that does seem to be happening a few times so far, anyway. So this episode is a little bit more on the fence, as far as my opinion goes. I'm going to be moving on to the next episode, and hopefully maybe they will be able to rectify some of these issues, but I'm not too hopeful. So we started at like a 6 or 7 out of 10. The last 2 episodes were like a solid 8 out of 10. We're back to about a 6 now, I think. So on average, we still hang around like a 7 out of 10 for this show so far, which is pretty good, but not great.